Welcome back. Now that we've spent some time with Mark, let's turn to Matthew, the gospel that begins the New Testament. Matthew's identity is an interesting one. In the Gospels, he's called Levi. And just like Mark, he had two names. Out of 7 references to Matthew, twice Levi is used, and 5 times Matthew is used. Both Mark and Luke use the name Levi when referring to Matthew's call to follow Jesus. The Gospel of Luke records after Matthew's call that Matthew invites Jesus to his house for a great banquet in Luke chapter 5, verse 27 through 29. The same dinner is also noted in Matthew 9, verse 10, where he has a dinner, and Mark notes this in chapter 2, verse 15, concerning a dinner at Levi's house. Interestingly, unlike Mark, who has both a Jewish and a Greek name, both of Matthew's names, Matthew and Levi, are Hebrew. Matthew was a tax collector when Jesus called him. That role was controversial. Tax collectors were often seen as traitors to their people, working for Rome, getting rich off the backs of fellow Jews. So when Jesus invited Matthew to follow him, it wasn't just surprising, it was scandalous. And yet, Matthew followed. Some scholars suggest that Jesus may have been the one who gave Levi the name, which means gift of God, much like how Jesus renames Simon Peter. I think it's also important to note that as well, it's possible that Levi was the surname of Matthew, which had been Matthew ben, son of Levi. Ben means son of. We see further usage and identification of Matthew, of course, in Matthew chapter 9, 9 through 10, where Jesus calls Matthew, who is a tax collector, and they go to his house for dinner. Then again in Matthew 10, verse 3, where he himself refers to himself as Matthew, the tax collector, one of the 12. As we continue to follow the gospel accounts, we see in Mark chapter 2, verse 14 through 15, that Mark refers to him as Levi, son of Alphaeus, from the tax collector's booth, and of course mentions that Jesus had dinner at Levi's house. Mark also seems to switch name references back and forth when he refers to Matthew. For example, in Mark chapter 3, verse 13 through 18, he lists Matthew as one of the 12, designating him as an apostle to preach and drive out demons. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, 27 through 29, we see that Luke notes Jesus seeing a tax collector named Levi. As a result, they all record that Levi had a great banquet. These accounts all agree that Matthew throws a banquet at his house, and Jesus attends, dining with sinners and tax collectors. This tells us something powerful about Jesus' mission, and it tells us something about Matthew. Once called, he was all in. As we continue to follow the story of Matthew in the Gospels, we see again his call in Luke chapter 6, verse 15, where Luke lists the call of Levi and Matthew as the disciple. And then as we move into Acts chapter 1, verse 13, Luke continues his narrative by including Matthew in the final list of Jesus' disciples. From these accounts, we can tell that Matthew was a tax collector, and if his father's name was Levi, he may have been a Levite. We don't know really any more details about Matthew's life after Acts chapter 1, verse 13, but church history tells us that he continued to preach, possibly in regions like Ethiopia, Macedonia, and Syria. Irenaeus, who was a Greek bishop from Smyrna and evangelized by Polycarp, who was in turn evangelized by the Apostle John, says this about Matthew. He preached the gospel among the Hebrews, but does not say whether it was in Palestine or abroad. Clement of Alexandria says he ministered 15 years and reports that Matthew went to the Ethiopians, the Greek, the Macedonians, the Syrians, and the Persians. Let me give some final thoughts on Matthew's identity. Think about this. Matthew, or Levi, was a son of Alphaeus, as recorded in Mark chapter 2, verse 14, and the brother of James the Less, as recorded in Mark chapter 3, verse 18. We can probably safely assume that Alphaeus was a good Orthodox Jew and gave the name Levi as evidence of strict religious values. But based on Matthew's profession, we can conclude he was a very ambitious and greedy man, which is quite different from his father's faith. The term tax collector does not carry a positive note in the New Testament. By Matthew becoming one, he had aligned himself with the hated house of Herod, and even more hated imperial Rome. So Matthew's greed and ambition drove him to align himself with those that were definitely despised by the Jews. On the other hand, it's believed that James the Less may have been a zealot, who was just the opposite of Matthew. The Zealots were a fanatical sect that arose in Judea to oppose the Roman domination of Palestine. Known as the Zealots, they fought their most famous battle at the great fortress of Masada, where 1,000 defenders took their own lives just as Romans were about to storm the fort. Now, think about the division this family had. And now think about how Jesus reconciled both of them to himself and to each other, since both were now fully committed to Jesus. All were amazingly transformed by Jesus. And so the Gospel of Matthew is deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, and we'll see how he draws connection between Jesus and the Old Testament, portraying Jesus as the promised Messiah. All right, as we close this section, let's follow up with a quick review. What does the biblical evidence reveal about Matthew's name? Matthew, like John, had two names. However, unlike John, Mark and Matthew's names were both Hebrew names. The scriptural record indicates that Matthew and Levi were one and the same person. The priestly name Levi suggests that Matthew's father was an Orthodox Jew, possibly of the priestly line. Jesus may have given the name Matthew to Levi when he called him to become one of his disciples, just as he gave Simon the name Peter. Alphaeus, however, may have had the surname Levi, in which case Matthew would have also had the surname Levi as well.